The Illyrian students shook, their scales rattling, as they looked upon pictures of mass graves overflowing with the charred corpses of human soldiers. Each man had died for his country. This mound of burnt bodies was never retrieved from the battlefield. The men were left to fertilize the soil with their final sacrifice. Alan Simmons stood upon the podium after making that declaration, sternly scanning over the horrified young aliens. Today he had been invited to speak about humanity's war history at the Illyrian's premier military university. At first his audience seemed skeptical of the older man, whispering that a member of such a young race couldn't teach them anything. How deliciously wrong they were. Alan began by recounting humanity's path to the stars. First contact with the Illyrians had been peaceful but tense, as the technologically superior race viewed mankind as a primitive people, too recently recovered from their world wars. Alan delved into the immense catalogue of humanity's bloody conflicts. His withered fingers danced across the holographic displays, pulling up images of crumbled cities, of brothers bleeding out in their siblings' arms on the beaches of Normandy, of nuclear shadows burnt into walls. He showed men with their legs blown off. He played videos of incendiary bombs roasting entire platoons alive as they screamed in their foxholes. He spoke of how human commanders would throw wave after wave of their own men into the meat grinder to capture a small hill. He spoke of how entire cities of civilians would be obliterated to damage the enemy's morale. For all their technological advantages, humans were willing to go to the most extreme lengths to win. They would fight longer, sacrifice more, go further into the abyss than any other race even considered possible. The students who were laughing at the start of the lecture now looked as if they were going to vomit, their scaly hands trembling as they took notes. Alan outlined how humanity's sheer ruthless brutality left them unmatched. Their willingness to die by the millions for small strategic gains, their fanatical refusal to ever surrender, their psychological need for vengeance and conquest. He showed the limitless creativity in how humans found new ways to slaughter each other: nerve gas, weaponized diseases, torture. He spoke of how humanity had nearly wiped itself out several times simply because they despised each other so deeply over ideology or ethnicity. Surely once our advanced fleets entered your solar system, we could simply bomb you into submission. Your puny weapons couldn't touch us. You'd have to surrender. Alan chuckled darkly, turning to face the poor fool. Let me tell you a story, son. Let me tell you how we dealt with the last alien race arrogant enough to challenge us. Alan touched a few buttons and the screens changed. A title flashed in bright red letters: The Slaughter of the Volmar. The human veteran took a deep breath, preparing to scar these naive students even deeper than they could imagine. Alan's eyes narrowed, his wrinkled face illuminated by the projection screens in the lecture hall. He scanned the rows of Illyrian students, many now looking pale as their previous bravado vanished. The old soldier cleared his throat and began to speak. It was about 10 years ago during the war with the Kraltak. Nasty bastards they were, built like tanks and twice as mean. Command had received intel that the Kraltak were planning something big. We needed to know what. I was tasked with leading a small team, Operation Phantom Blade, to infiltrate one of their heavily fortified bases and retrieve that information. The students leaned forward in their seats, hanging on his every word. Even Pixis, the bold one who had questioned Alan earlier, now listened with rapt attention. We knew we were outnumbered and outgunned, so we had to fight smart. We hacked into their comms network, made them think they were being attacked on the other side of the base. That drew away most of their forces. We also used the local wildlife to our advantage, luring predators to their perimeter to cause chaos. Alan's voice grew heavy as he continued. But even with all that, it was a tough fight. We lost good people. Private Jenkins. He took a plasma bolt to the chest covering our escape, held off a dozen Kraltak on his own before he went down. And Lieutenant Hernandez, she was our tech expert. Stayed behind to make sure we got the data and the Kraltak couldn't purge it. Never saw her again. The room was silent save for the soft hum of the projector. Pixis tentatively raised a hand. How did you cope with losing your team members? Alan sighed, a distant look in his eyes. In war you have to make hard choices. You have to be willing to sacrifice. The bonds you form with your brothers and sisters in arms, they're unbreakable. And when they give their lives, it's your duty to make sure their sacrifice wasn't in vain, to remember what they died for. He turned back to the screens, pulling up a new set of schematics and battle plans. The intel we got from that mission showed the Kralthak had a weakness in their defensive line. We exploited that, and it turned the whole war around, led us to victory. It wasn't about who had the biggest guns or the fanciest ships. It was about grit, determination, the things that make us human. Alan continued his lecture, delving into the psychological aspects of human warfare. In the face of rapidly changing situations, human soldiers are trained to adapt and think creatively. Mental resilience is key, Alan explained. Let me share a story from my own training. They put us through this brutal simulation where we got captured by the enemy. They subjected us to intense interrogation, messed with our heads, trying to break us. The students listened intently, their eyes wide. It was rough, but we had to rely on our wits, our training, and our bond as a team to resist their tactics. Me and my buddies, we stuck together, kept each other strong. Eventually, we managed to escape. Alan's voice grew firm. That kind of harsh training is necessary. It prepares you for the realities of war, the mental strain. As he spoke, Alan noticed Pixis leaning forward, a glimmer of admiration in his eyes, a newfound respect for the mental fortitude of human warriors. Shifting gears, Alan discussed the role of technology in human warfare. Now, we may not always have the most advanced weapons or equipment, he acknowledged, but we're damn good at adapting, at using whatever we've got to our advantage. He recounted a skirmish with a technologically superior alien race. We managed to get our hands on one of their devices, used it to jam their comms, threw their whole operation into chaos, turned the tide of the battle. Just as Alan was about to move on, an alarm blared throughout the lecture hall. The students looked around, confusion etched on their faces. A holographic display materialized in the center of the room, revealing the grim visage of an Illyrian military official. "Apologies for the interruption, Commander Simmons," the official said. "We have an emergency situation. Kralthak insurgents have seized a nearby research facility, taking our scientists hostage. We need your help. You're the only one with experience dealing with the Kralthak." Alan's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. He turned to the stunned students. "Looks like class is dismissed," he declared. "Time to put theory into practice." Alan strode purposefully towards the exit, his weathered face set in determination. As he reached the doorway, a voice called out from behind him. Alan halted, turning to see Pixis standing tall, his scales glinting under the harsh lighting. The young Illyrian met Alan's gaze unflinchingly. "I know I challenged you earlier," Pixis admitted, "but I believe I can learn a great deal from observing you in action." Alan considered the request, searching Pixis's eyes. There was a fire there, a hunger to prove himself. It was a look Alan knew all too well. After a moment, he nodded curtly. "All right, Pixis, but you follow my lead and do exactly as I say. This isn't a simulation." "Understood, Commander," Pixis replied solemnly. The unlikely pair made their way swiftly to the besieged research facility. As they approached, Alan surveyed the scene with a trained eye. Kralthak insurgents had fortified their position inside the main laboratory, using the captive scientists as living shields. A frontal assault would be bloody. Alan's mind raced, formulating a plan. His gaze fell upon a nondescript maintenance hatch. "There," he pointed. "We'll infiltrate through the service tunnels, minimize engagement, maintain the element of surprise." Pixis followed Alan's lead as they slipped silently into the narrow passageways. The air was stale, the only sound the soft tread of their boots against metal grating. As they navigated the maze-like tunnels, Alan spoke in hushed tones. "In a situation like this, patience is key. Maintain a cool head, think before you act." In a blur of motion, Alan sprang forward. A precise strike to the throat, a swift kick to the knee. The guards crumpled like marionettes with their strings cut. Pixis watched in awe as Alan dispatched the threat with ruthless efficiency. Silently, Alan motioned for Pixis to help conceal the unconscious Kraltak. They dragged the bodies into a shadowed alcove, out of sight. "The less evidence of our presence, the better," Alan whispered. Deeper they delved into the facility's bowels. Finally, they reached a nondescript door, the control room. Alan made short work of the lock, his fingers flying across the keypad. Inside, Alan immediately set to work on the security terminal, his brow furrowed in concentration. Pixis watched as lines of alien code flashed across the screen, incomprehensible to him. "I'm in," Alan declared triumphantly. "Communications jammed, hostage location confirmed." He turned to Pixis. "I need you to stay here, monitor the feeds. If you see anything at all, you radio me, understood?" Pixis wanted nothing more than to be at Alan's side, but he recognized the gravity of his task. "Yes, Commander, I won't let you down." With a curt nod, Alan slipped back into the hallway, moving like a ghost towards the heart of the crisis. Pixis settled into the chair, his eyes glued to the bank of monitors, ready to be Alan's eyes and ears. Alan crept through the shadowed corridors, his footsteps barely a whisper against the cold metal floor. As he approached the main laboratory, a heavily fortified door loomed before him, a daunting obstacle between him and the hostages trapped within. But Alan was no stranger to Kraltak security systems. His fingers danced across the control panel, manipulating the locking mechanism with a deft touch. Encryption codes flashed across the screen, but Alan's mind worked faster, deciphering the alien language with practiced ease. With a final keystroke, the door slid open, revealing the room beyond. Inside, the hostages huddled together, their faces etched with fear. Kraltak insurgents stood guard, their weapons trained on the captives. Alan's eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail, every potential threat. With a series of hand signals, Alan communicated his plan to the hostages. "Stay low, be ready to move." The scientists nodded, their bodies tense with anticipation. Alan reached into his pack, his fingers closing around a flash grenade. In one swift motion, he pulled the pin and tossed the device into an adjacent room. A blinding light erupted, followed by a deafening bang. The Kraltak guards turned, momentarily distracted by the sudden commotion. That was all the opening Alan needed. He burst into the room, his movements a blur of speed and precision. The first insurgent fell to a well-placed strike to the throat, his weapon clattering to the floor. Alan pivoted, his elbow connecting with the second guard's jaw, sending him reeling. One by one, the Kraltak insurgents fell to Alan's onslaught, their bodies crumpling to the ground. But the leader, a battle-hardened warrior, stood his ground. He lunged at Alan, his claws slashing through the air. The two titans clashed in a fierce dance of combat, trading blows and grappling for dominance. Alan ducked and weaved, his years of training guiding his every move. The Kraltak leader was strong, but Alan was faster, more agile. He targeted the warrior's weak points, striking at the joints and pressure points with surgical precision. The Kraltak leader's movements grew sluggish, his breath coming in ragged gasps. In a final, decisive move, Alan seized the leader's arm, twisting it behind his back. With a swift chop to the neck, he rendered the warrior unconscious, his body slumping to the floor. The hostages stared at Alan in awe, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and admiration. Alan quickly freed them from their bonds, urging them to follow him back through the maintenance tunnels. As they navigated the narrow passages, Alan's comm crackled to life. It was Pixis, his voice urgent. "Commander, I'm picking up movement on the security feeds. Reinforcements are closing in on your position." Alan's mind raced, formulating a new plan. "Pixis, can you hack into the facility's automated defenses? Program the turrets to target the insurgents." There was a pause, then Pixis's voice returned, filled with determination. "I'm on it, Commander." Moments later, the sound of gunfire echoed through the tunnels. The facility's own defenses had turned against the Kraltak, providing cover for Alan and the hostages' escape. They emerged from the facility, blinking in the sudden daylight. Illyrian security forces swarmed around them, taking the hostages to safety and apprehending the remaining insurgents. Alan turned to Pixis, clapping a hand on the young Illyrian's shoulder. "You did well in there, kid. Quick thinking with the turrets. Looks like you've learned a thing or two today." Pixis stood a little taller, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. He had seen firsthand the skills and determination that made humans such formidable warriors, and under Alan's guidance, he knew he had the potential to become one himself. As the debrief with the Illyrian military officials concluded, Alan's mind raced with the implications of what they had learned. The Kralthak insurgents were merely pawns in a much larger game, one that threatened the very stability of the Illyrian government. He knew he had to act fast. Turning to Pixis, Alan spoke with urgency. "This goes deeper than we thought. We need to investigate this rogue faction, find out who's pulling the strings." Pixis nodded, his scales glinting under the harsh light of the briefing room. "I want to help, Commander. I know the ins and outs of Illyrian politics. I could be an asset." Alan considered the young Illyrian's request. He saw the potential in Pixis, the keen mind and unwavering determination. With a curt nod, he made his decision. "All right, Pixis, you're with me on this. But remember, this isn't a classroom. The stakes are real." As they began their investigation, Alan and Pixis pored over intelligence reports and intercepted communications. A pattern began to emerge, a trail of corruption that led straight to the heart of the Illyrian military-industrial complex. "Look at this," Pixis pointed to a series of encrypted messages. "These are orders to divert weapons and resources to a secret location, and they're signed by Admiral Zarkos." Alan's eyes narrowed. Admiral Zarkos was a high-ranking Illyrian official, one with the power and influence to orchestrate a conspiracy of this magnitude. They needed to get closer, to find irrefutable proof of his involvement. "We need to get into Zarkos's private compound," Alan declared. "That's where we'll find the evidence we need." Pixis's eyes widened. "The compound is heavily guarded, Commander. We can't just walk in the front door." A sly grin tugged at the corner of Alan's mouth. Who said anything about the front door? Under the cover of darkness, Alan and Pixis approached the perimeter of Admiral Zarkos's compound. Pixis, using his knowledge of Illyrian security protocols, managed to temporarily disable the sensor grid, allowing them to slip past the outer defenses. As they made their way towards the main building, Alan's instincts kicked into high gear. He motioned for Pixis to take cover, just as a pair of armed guards rounded the corner. With lightning speed, Alan closed the distance, disabling the guards with precise strikes to their pressure points. They crumpled to the ground, unconscious. "We need to keep moving," Alan whispered, dragging the guards' limp bodies out of sight. Inside the compound, they navigated the maze-like corridors, avoiding patrols and security cameras. Finally, they reached Admiral Zarkos's office. Alan made short work of the lock, and they slipped inside. The office was a treasure trove of incriminating evidence, detailed records of weapons shipments, communiques with Kralthak insurgents, and plans for a coup against the Illyrian government. Alan and Pixis quickly gathered the files, storing them on a secure data drive. Just as they were about to make their escape, the office door slammed open. Admiral Zarkos stood before them, flanked by a group of heavily armed loyalists. "Well, well," Zarkos sneered. "What do we have here, a human spy and a traitorous young Illyrian?" Alan and Pixis found themselves outgunned and outnumbered. But Alan knew that sometimes the most powerful weapon was not a gun, but the mind. "Think about what you're doing, Admiral," Alan began, his voice calm and measured. "Is this really what's best for the Illyrian people? Collaborating with the Kralthak? Destabilizing your own government?" As Alan spoke, Pixis's hand slowly drifted towards his communicator. With a few discreet taps, he sent out a distress signal to the Illyrian authorities, alerting them to their location and the situation at hand. Admiral Zarkos scoffed. "What you think doesn't matter, human. You're just pawns on a board much larger than you can comprehend. But Alan could see the flicker of doubt in some of the loyalists' eyes. He pressed on, using his knowledge of psychological warfare to drive a wedge between Zarkos and his men. "Is this the kind of leader you want to follow?" Alan addressed the loyalists. "One who would betray his own people for personal gain?" The loyalists exchanged uncertain glances. In that moment of hesitation, Alan saw his opening. He lunged forward, disarming Zarkos with a deft maneuver. The loyalists, caught off guard, fumbled with their weapons. Seizing the opportunity, Pixis sprang into action, using his Illyrian agility to dodge the incoming fire. He managed to disarm several of the loyalists, tossing their weapons to Alan. The room erupted into a flurry of close-quarters combat. Alan and Pixis fought back-to-back, their movements synchronized as if they had been training together for years. Zarkos's men fell one by one, until only the Admiral himself remained. Zarkos glared at Alan, hatred burning in his eyes. He reached for his sidearm, but Alan was faster. With a lightning-quick strike, he knocked the gun from Zarkos's hand and pinned him to the wall. Before Alan could press for more information, the sound of sirens filled the air. The Illyrian authorities had arrived, alerted by Pixis's distress signal. They stormed the compound, taking Admiral Zarkos and his remaining loyalists into custody. Pixis stood a little taller, pride shining in his eyes. "I had a good teacher." But even as they savoured their victory, Alan couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Zarkos's final words echoed in his mind, the real threat, waiting in the shadows. He knew their work was far from over. As the Illyrian authorities secured the scene, Alan and Pixis shared a look of grim determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The human soldier and the young Illyrian, an unlikely pair bound by a common cause. For now they had won a battle, but the war, Alan knew, was just beginning. Alan stood his ground, his eyes locked with Admiral Zarkos's as he continued to negotiate. "Think about what you're doing, Admiral," he said calmly. "The Kralthak are known for their deceit and cruelty. Is that really who you want to ally yourself with?" But Alan could see the flicker of doubt in some of the loyalists' eyes. He pressed on, his voice steady. "And what about your own people, Admiral? Are you willing to betray them, to plunge your society into chaos, all for the sake of power?" The loyalists shifted uneasily, their weapons lowering slightly. Admiral Zarkos's face twisted in anger. "Enough," he snarled. "I will not be lectured by a primitive creature like you." In that moment of tension, Pixis stepped forward, a data pad in his hand. "Admiral Zarkos," he said, his voice ringing out in the room, "there's something you should know." All eyes turned to the young Illyrian as he tapped the data pad, projecting a holographic image into the air. It was a genetic profile, complex strands of DNA rotating slowly. "I found this in your personal files, Admiral," Pixis said. "It's your genetic code, and it shows that you are part Kralthak." A collective gasp went through the room. Admiral Zarkos's face drained of color, his eyes wide with shock. That's impossible," he stammered. "I am Illyrian. I have always been Illyrian." But the evidence was irrefutable. The loyalists began to murmur among themselves, their faith in their leader crumbling. "So you lied to us," one of them said, his voice thick with betrayal. "You're not even one of us." Admiral Zarkos looked around wildly, seeing his support evaporating before his eyes. In a last desperate move, he grabbed a blaster from a nearby table and leveled it at Alan's chest. "If I can't have the Illyrian government," he snarled, "then no one can." Alan tensed, preparing to dodge the incoming shot. But before Admiral Zarkos could pull the trigger, the doors to the room burst open and a team of Illyrian special forces poured in, weapons drawn. "Drop your weapon, Admiral Zarkos," the team leader shouted. "You're under arrest for treason." In the chaos that followed, Alan and Pixis sprang into action. They disarmed Admiral Zarkos and subdued his remaining loyalists, working in tandem with the special forces to secure the room. As the dust settled, Alan and Pixis presented their evidence to the authorities. laying bare the full extent of Admiral Zarkos's treachery and his conspiracy with the Kralthak. The Illyrian officials were stunned, but grateful for the human and young Illyrian's efforts. In the days that followed, Admiral Zarkos and his collaborators were brought to justice, their schemes unraveled and their influence purged from Illyrian society. The government publicly commended Alan and Pixis for their bravery, dedicating resources to ensure that such a betrayal could never happen again. As Alan prepared to return to Earth, his mission complete, Pixis approached him with a request. "Commander Simmons," he said, his eyes shining with determination, "I want to continue my training under your guidance. I've learned so much from you about strategy, about adaptability, about what it really means to be a warrior. Please, let me continue to learn from you." Alan looked at Pixis, seeing the potential in the young Illyrian. The fire in his eyes reminded Alan of himself at that age, eager to make a difference in the galaxy. He placed a hand on Pixis's shoulder, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "All right, kid," he said. "Let's see what you're made of, but I warn you my training isn't for the faint of heart." Alan grinned, clapping a hand on Pixis's shoulder. "You've come a long way, kid. I'd be honored to continue your training back on Earth." Pixis's eyes shone with excitement. "Thank you, Commander. I won't let you down." A few days later, they stood on the tarmac of an Illyrian spaceport, a sleek human vessel waiting to transport them to Earth. As they boarded, Pixis took one last look at his homeworld, a mix of anticipation and trepidation swirling within him. The journey was long, but Pixis spent the time peppering Alan with questions about Earth, about human culture and military tactics. Alan, for his part, found himself enjoying the role of mentor, recognizing in Pixis the same hunger for knowledge that had driven him as a young soldier. When they finally arrived on Earth, Pixis was awestruck. The sheer diversity of the planet, from its varied landscapes to its myriad cultures, was unlike anything he had encountered on Illyria. As they made their way to the military academy where Pixis would train, he absorbed every detail, every new sight and sound. The academy itself was a sprawling complex, a hive of activity as recruits from various allied species trained alongside human soldiers. Pixis, the first Illyrian to join their ranks, drew curious glances, but he held his head high, determined to prove himself. From the very first day, the training was intense. Grueling physical conditioning pushed Pixis to his limits, the Earth's higher gravity making every movement a challenge. Advanced tactical simulations threw him into the heart of chaotic, ever-changing scenarios, forcing him to think on his feet and adapt. Throughout it all, Alan was there, overseeing Pixis's progress, offering guidance and pushing him to reach new heights. He saw the young Illyrian not just as a student, but as a partner, a brother in arms. As the weeks turned into months, Pixis grew stronger, faster, sharper. He sparred with human soldiers, learning their unique fighting styles and sharing his own. In quiet moments between training sessions, he listened to their stories, their hopes and fears, and found that despite their differences, they shared a common bond. One evening, as Pixis and a group of his human comrades sat around a campfire, swapping tales of their homeworlds, he realized that he no longer felt like an outsider. Earth had become a second home, these soldiers his family. But the respite was short-lived. Midway through his training, an urgent message arrived from Illyria. A Kralthak splinter group, thirsty for vengeance after Admiral Zarkos's defeat, had launched a series of brutal attacks on Illyrian colonies. Civilian casualties were mounting, and the Illyrian government was struggling to contain the threat. They needed help, and they needed it fast. Recognizing the unique skills that Pixis had developed and his strong connection with Alan, they requested that the two of them lead a joint human-Illyrian task force to counter the Kralthak insurgency. Alan and Pixis, both grim-faced as they read the message, knew they had no choice. They had to act and act quickly. Within hours, they had assembled their team, elite soldiers from both species, each hand-picked for their specialized skills and combat experience. There was Jax, a human marksman who could hit a target from a kilometer away, Nira, an Illyrian tech expert who could hack any system, Rin, a human demolition specialist with a knack for improvised explosives, and a dozen others, the best of the best. As they boarded their transport, a sense of purpose settled over the group. They knew the stakes, knew the risks, but they also knew that failure was not an option. In the days that followed, they struck hard and fast at Kralthak strongholds across Illyrian space. Alan and Pixis worked in perfect sync, the humans' tactical brilliance, complemented by the Illyrians' technological prowess. They led daring raids, gathered crucial intelligence, and slowly but surely began to turn the tide. But the Kralthak were cunning, ruthless. In one particularly harrowing engagement, Alan and Pixis found themselves cut off from their team, cornered by a superior enemy force. Outnumbered and outgunned, they took cover in the ruins of a bombed-out building, the sounds of Kralthak war cries echoing from all sides. Alan, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, turned to Pixis. "Remember that vulnerability in their weapon systems you discovered during your studies on Earth?" Pixis nodded, his mind racing. "I think it's time we put that knowledge to use," Alan said, a glint of determination in his eye. "Here's the plan." As Alan outlined his bold gambit, Pixis felt a surge of adrenaline. It was risky, unconventional, but it just might work. They set their trap, using the Kralthak's own salvage technology against them. Pixis, his fingers flying over a captured Kralthak control pad, coaxed the enemy's automated defenses to life. Alan, meanwhile, lured the bulk of the Kralthak force into position. At the crucial moment, Pixis hit the final command. The Kralthak's weapon systems turned as if possessed by a ghostly hand and opened fire on their own troops. Chaos erupted as the Kralthak soldiers, caught completely off guard, fell to the onslaught of their own firepower. In the confusion, Alan and Pixis made their move. They burst from cover, engaging the disoriented survivors with a ferocity born of desperation. It was a brutal, close-quarters fight, but one by one the Kralthak fell. As the smoke cleared from the battlefield, Alan and Pixis surveyed the carnage. The Kralthak forces lay scattered, their weapons abandoned as they fled in disarray. The human Illyrian task force cheered, their spirits lifted by the hard-fought victory. "That was a hell of a plan, Alan," Pixis said, clapping his mentor on the shoulder. "Using their own tech against them. I never would have thought of that." Alan grinned, wiping the sweat and grime from his brow. "Sometimes you gotta fight dirty to win clean. And you played your part perfectly, kid. Those hacking skills of yours, invaluable." As the task force regrouped and tended to their wounded, a sense of camaraderie rippled through the ranks. Humans and Illyrians alike shared rations, swapped stories, and tended to each other's injuries. The battle had forged a bond between them, a shared purpose that transcended species. But even as they savored their triumph, Alan and Pixis knew their work was far from over. As they sifted through the intelligence gathered from the Kralthak base, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. "Look at these communiques," Pixis said, his brow furrowed as he scanned the datapad. "The Kralthak, they're not acting alone. There's mentions of weapons shipments, financial transactions, all from outside sources." Alan nodded grimly. "Arms dealers, corrupt politicians. Looks like the Kralthak have some powerful friends in low places." "Money, power, influence," Alan said. "War is a profitable business for those who know how to exploit it, and the longer the Kralthak can keep these colonies destabilized, the more their backers can profit," Pixis finished, a look of disgust on his face. They brought their findings to the task force leadership, who agreed that this network of corruption had to be exposed and dismantled. And so, Alan and Pixis found themselves embarking on a new mission, one that would take them into the seedy underbelly of the galactic underworld. Gone were the overt military strikes and frontal assaults. Now they operated in the shadows, conducting covert raids on black market arms depots, infiltrating the private estates of corrupt officials, and hacking into the encrypted communications of criminal syndicates. It was during one such mission that Pixis found himself face to face with a ghost from his past. They had tracked a high-ranking Kralthak warlord, one who had once served under Admiral Zarkos, to a remote outpost on the fringes of Illyrian space. As Pixis slipped through the outpost's dimly lit corridors, he suddenly found himself yanked into a darkened room. A scaly hand clamped over his mouth. He struggled, but his assailant was strong, holding him in an iron grip. "Well, well," a rasping voice hissed in his ear. "If it isn't the little Illyrian traitor, Pixis, isn't it?" The hand released him, and Pixis spun to face his captor. It was the warlord himself, his scarred face twisted in a sneer. "So you," Pixis spat, "you served Zarkos, you betrayed our people." The warlord laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Betrayed? No, boy, I served a higher purpose. The Kralthak, we are the future, and your kind, you are nothing more than cattle to be culled." Pixis felt his blood boil, his fists clenching at his sides. "We beat you before, we'll beat you again." "Beat us?" the warlord scoffed. "You have no idea what you're up against. This war, it's just the beginning. The Kralthak, we will not rest until every last Illyrian is either enslaved or dead." Something snapped inside Pixis. With a roar of fury, he lunged at the warlord, his fists flying. The Kralthak was ready for him, blocking his blows with practiced ease. They traded strikes, Pixis' agility matched against the warlord's brute strength. But Pixis had an edge, one honed through countless hours of training under Alan's watchful eye. He remembered his mentor's words, drilled into him over and over. "Use your opponent's strength against them, find their weakness, and exploit it." He ducked under a heavy swing, then countered with a rapid series of jabs to the warlord's unprotected flanks. The Kralthak grunted in pain, his movements slowing. Pixis pressed his advantage, raining down blows, targeting the weak points in the warlord's armor. With a final, desperate lunge, the warlord tried to grapple Pixis, to crush him in his massive arms, but Pixis was ready. He sidestepped the grab, then delivered a devastating knee strike to the warlord's chin. The Kralthak's head snapped back, and he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Pixis stood over his fallen foe, his chest heaving, his knuckles bruised and bloody. But in his heart a fire burned, a fierce determination to see this fight through to the end. Over the following weeks, Alan and Pixis, along with their task force allies, worked tirelessly to unravel the web of corruption that fueled the Kralthak insurgency. They raided secret meetings, intercepted illicit transactions, and pieced together a damning trail of evidence that led all the way to the highest echelons of power in various alien governments. With each revelation, with each conspirator brought to justice, the Kralthak's support structure crumbled, and with the capture of the warlord, the heart of their movement was ripped out. Leaderless and cut off from their backers, the remaining Kralthak fighters scattered, their threat to the Illyrian colonies all but eliminated. In the aftermath, as the task force celebrated their hard-won victory, Alan and Pixis found themselves the center of attention. Illyrian dignitaries lauded their bravery, while human commanders praised their ingenuity. They were hailed as heroes, shining examples of what could be achieved through cooperation and understanding between species. But for Alan and Pixis, the true reward was something deeper. It was in the unbreakable bond they had forged, a friendship that had been tested in the crucible of war and emerged stronger than ever. It was in the knowledge that they had made a real difference, that they had helped to build a future in which humans and Illyrians could stand side by side as allies. As they stood together, watching the Illyrian colonies begin the slow process of rebuilding, Alan turned to Pixis with a smile. "You did good, kid," he said. "Damn good, I'm proud of you." Pixis returned the smile, his eyes shining with a newfound sense of purpose. "I had a good teacher," he replied. "The best." They clasped hands, human and Illyrian, united in their shared triumph. And though they knew that new challenges surely lay ahead, they faced that uncertain future with the confidence of those who had already overcome the impossible. As their transport shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere, Alan and Pixis sat in silence, the weight of their recent victory overshadowed by the uncertain future that lay ahead. The human government had welcomed them back, with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension, their success against the Kralthak, tempered by growing concerns over the Illyrians' increasing power. In the days that followed, Alan found himself called before a panel of high-ranking officials, their faces etched with worry as they debated the implications of the Illyrian alliance. He listened as they spoke of the need to protect human interests, to ensure that the Illyrians would never pose a threat to Earth's security. With a heavy heart, Alan realized what he had to do. He sought out Pixis, finding him in the training room they had spent countless hours in, honing their skills and forging their bond. "Pixis," Alan began, his voice strained. "We need to talk." Alan took a deep breath, steeling himself for the words he knew he had to say. "The government, they've made a decision. They want to limit further collaboration with the Illyrians. They're worried about the power your people are gaining." Pixis stared at him in disbelief, his scales rippling with emotion. But we've proven that we can work together. We defeated the Kralthak, exposed the conspiracy. How can they just turn their backs on that?" "It's not that simple, Pixis," Alan sighed. "The political climate here on Earth has changed. People are scared, and the government has to put the interests of our own people first." "And what about us?" Pixis demanded, his voice rising. "What about everything we've been through together? Are you just going to abandon me? Abandon our friendship?" Alan closed his eyes, the weight of his decision bearing down on him. "I have no choice, Pixis. You have to go back to your homeworld. I can't be your mentor anymore." Pixis reeled back as if he had been struck, his eyes shimmering with betrayal. "Alan, please, don't do this. We can find a way. We can make them understand." But Alan shook his head, his resolve unwavering even as his heart ached. "I'm sorry, Pixis. This is how it has to be. You have to go home." In the days that followed, Pixis prepared for his return to the Illyrian homeworld, his movements mechanical, his eyes distant. Alan watched from afar, the gulf between them growing with each passing moment. On the day of Pixis's departure, they stood together one last time, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Alan extended his hand, a final gesture of the bond they had shared. "Take care of yourself, Pixis," he said softly. "Remember what you've learned and use it to make your people strong." With a final nod, Pixis turned and boarded the waiting transport, his silhouette disappearing into the ship's interior. Alan stood on the launch pad, watching as the vessel lifted off, carrying his friend and student back to the stars. As the ship vanished into the sky, Alan felt a profound sense of loss, the weight of his decision settling over him like a shroud. He knew that the path ahead would be difficult, that the rift between humans and Illyrians would only continue to grow. But even in the face of that uncertain future, Alan held on to the hope that the bond he had forged with Pixis, the understanding they had built, would somehow endure. That someday, the lessons they had learned from each other would guide them back to the path of peace. With a heavy heart, Alan turned away from the launch pad, ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. The story of the human soldier and the Illyrian warrior was far from over, and he knew that the choices they made in the coming days would shape the fate of the galaxy itself. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.